Jeremy Reed, welcome to the ICA. Jeremy, you're a poet and a novelist, which is to say that you've written 4 collections of poetry and 2 novels, the latest of which is Blue Rock, just published by Cape. But I know that it's primarily as a poet that, in fact, you see yourself. In fact, once you wrote to Kathleen Raine on Vernon Watkins, For Whom Does a Poet Write? This delighted me. How often I have tried to impress on people that a poet is never free, never released from bond, that unless one has this irrevocable commitment, one should pursue another course in life. So I wanted to ask you first, what it means to you to be a poet.
Well, being a poet is, for me, an absolute commitment, which means that there is no separation between my life and my work. The two are inextricably one. I see it as being invested with a particular responsibility, a living out of something which is dependent on the inner and outer world. I see it as carrying a light within one, which one has to protect against many pressures, against many sectors of life. Above all, I see this very deep commitment.
There are certain inherent risks, obviously, in a vocation which requires, nothing less than your life's blood, which is, in a way, what you're saying. I mean, what are those risks that you see?
The risks are inevitably that of possible damage to one's health, because one is always creating out of oneself, out of inner space, out of one's mental cosmos. Therefore, it's part of the sacredness of the vocation of poetry that one has a psychophysical unity so that one's body and one's mind are very much the same expression. And so that there's no division between what one's doing and who one is.
Right. So it's very much bound up with the question of identity in a way.
Very much so.
There is, in your first novel, The Lipstick Boys, there's a passage where your protagonist, who is also a poet, says, and I'll just read this briefly, "I have to keep writing rather as a heroin addict has to fix. Poetry is my compulsive obsession. It burns the metabolism out like lit petroleum. I look for words in the light of the conflagratory colours. They never fail me in their conjurative order. They are the pieces of a mental jigsaw puzzle that one integrates by uniting disparities, by steadying their apparent incongruity through the focus of a metaphorical telescope. I have to keep the eyepiece clear, polished and magnified too. Who am I?" That last tiny but biting phrase, "who am I?" that seems to me there is bound up with it, almost as though the act of writing poetry is in itself a struggle for identity. Would you see that?
Yes, it is a journey, an inner voyage to the innermost self, and the idea of the telescoping in of language is, writing of poetry is rather like using a jeweler's eyepiece, a lens, which of course is also the lens focused upon oneself, so that in a way it is done through a mirror.
I just wanted to ask you how you relate to traditional notions of the poet as inspired, the poet as having a muse.
Yes, I relate to that very strongly. One cannot write poetry without inspiration, and inspiration is the gift of poetry, and how one views it, whether it's an internal engenderment, whether it's generated by an external force, it is the living matter of poetry. It is the fire that makes the language become poetry. Without it, it would just be language. One could call it just simply imaginative energy, imaginative dynamism, but inspiration is, yes, the operative word.
Right. That's sort of relation with an external, if you like, but there's also,
Yes.
seems to me very much in your work, a relation with an internal, which is, if you like, the creative conflict between the masculine and the feminine, which is in everyone, but very particularly in your understanding of the feminine, peculiarly creative side of a person's nature. Indeed, I think again in a letter to Kathleen Rain you once wrote, the adoption of a feminine mask has always been for me an esoteric pact whereby I identify with a higher source. What did you exactly mean by that?
I think that in the act of creating poetry, what could be called the irreconcilables of feminine and masculine are reconciled, united. Therefore, for me, poetry is in part of ritualization, and therefore I use a ritual in order to write it. The use of perfume, the use of cosmetics, to me, are important in the actual creation of it because it heightens concentration. It invokes, it conjures almost in the form of shamanism, in the form of primitive magic. The adoption of the feminine, of course, is the completion of the androgyne, the androgynous mask. And when one is in that state, that is the state of inspiration, that is the state of invulnerability, the state of power. And then when one divests oneself of that mask, then the power is gone.
So in a way, it's back to the idea of disparity and making a unity. I mean, here are two disparate things.
Very much so.
And what you're trying to do is bring them together, even only for a moment, into a one whole out of which a creative energy is in some way released.
Yes, I would see it very much as that.
The whole idea of mask and establishing an identity either under a mask or with a mask is very potent in your work. And indeed, in the newest novel, I would say the central theme of this book is really identity and the fluidity of identity and how one becomes a person and another person and maybe invades other people's minds indeed. And there's one interesting character in this book, Claudette, who is a man who needs to metamorphosize into a woman to find what is her true identity. And I think there's one passage I'd very much like you to read because it seems to me to contain very many ideas and themes that come up in all of your work, which is Claudette scrutinizing herself in the mirror.
Thank you. Claudette scrutinized the features that had been a lifetime's obsession in the breath-frosted oval mirror that she traveled with. Its rococo gilt frame was spiraled into bell-shaped flowers. Mignonettes intertwined with asphodel snaked from a dolphin's mouth into the tracery of a cupid unleashing his arrow. She had made the bathroom into an artist's studio of cosmetics. Her vanity case contained a liter of liquid silicone, disposable syringes, a cache of vermilion and carmine Dior lipsticks, eye pencils, blue and aquamarine and gold, dusted palettes of eyeshadows, a bottle of Oscar La Renta, and a large black gold egg of creme majeur by Yves Saint Laurent. She smoothed cream gently into her face, feeling the activating microcirculation that this brought about, the exciting introduction of hydroflectin into her pores. It was her habit to test whichever new cosmetics were introduced into the competitive field of beauty care. She would look for the transformations in her face, a translucency she hadn't been aware of before, an erasure of the hair-fine crow's feet that veined the skin beneath her eyes like the tendril branching in an ivy leaf. She penciled on 2 mauve, linear eyebrows. It was like recomposing a face, she thought. Neither her mother nor father could lay claim to her new birth. She was the child of a skilled surgeon, Claudette. She tried to picture her mother's baffled surprise if they were reintroduced, she with the big peasant's hands molded and chapped from years of working the land on an impoverished farm in Brittany. Claudette's only holidays as a child had been spent on the Ile de Hua in a whitewashed granite cottage, the roof slates oranged with lichen, the outside water pump cranked in the morning to get the day's supply of drinking and washing water. She used to get up before her parents and cousin and look up at the pink and green ice slivers of stars which were visible above the horizon. Even then, she hadn't felt right as she was, a frail, young man with bewitchingly high cheekbones, already drawing attention to himself by refusing to wash in cold water or to swim naked in the ultramarine shallows. She had guarded the privacy of her body. She had a secret to keep, but she could never let out. She didn't want things to be as they were, that swinging, mushroom-capped appendage between the thighs was too external. She wanted to be retractile, intimate with herself, concealed as the eye of a rose in the convolutions of its petals. She used to lie in the stiff marram grass and watch her cousin hurl boulder after boulder into the sea. He would balance an angular granite block over his head and smash it into the water. A white cauliflower head of froth boiled on the sapphire for an instant and then subsided. All of his latent aggression, all of the as yet unpronounced masculinity in him tested itself against the elements. Daily, he grew more sun-bronzed by the wind. When Claudette showed him the blue harebells and sea pinks and corn salad that she had found amongst the rocks, he mocked her. He said, "That's for girls. Boys don't pick flowers. Why don't you come and flip pebbles on the flat of the wave?" He could make a stone jump 6 times like a swallow, skimming the wave. But Claudette would walk away. When she was alone, she was safe. She could integrate with her true self. She could soliloquize, and there were always the sea stars at night or a moon anchoring its pearl in the navy blue bay. She learned to make the rhythm of her breath correspond to the ocean. Each time a wave dragged its white swash over shingle, she breathed in. The sea could enter her like that. When she exhaled, the wave was chasing back through pebbles that jumped like dice across an uneven surface. She would become entranced like that. Flux and reflux, systole and diastole, the incessant movement of the sea. One morning she awoke when the farm cocks were issuing their madrigal to the forced dawn, and went outside and looked into the old stone well. The water was a jet film with a moonstone of light superimposed on it from the sky. As she looked down and a cloud obscured the moon, she was conscious of her own transformation. She didn't know what was happening, only that she knew she was staring at the image of a pretty girl's face. That image was never to leave her. When she stared into the cracked, defaced mirror in the cottage hall, she was furious at what she found. The change hadn't really taken place. She still had the features of a boy, only that she surprised herself by pouting and tracing admiringly explorative fingers over the contours of her cheekbones. If she stared long enough, she believed she would see the transformation occur. The old face would shed its skin, and in its place would come the translucent, twinkling highlights in a young girl's face and eyes. How she wished the skin would be of the finest gold, the eyes violet, the lips so dark as to give the impression of having been deepened in tone by the application of an imperceptible lipstick. She went back to her room, lay down on the coarse blanketed bed, and waited for the daylight. All of those secret dawns had affected the mutation. The urge she had felt to expose her body to radiant starlight, to lie face down in white clover and smell the earth and sea, had somehow resolved the conflict within her. She had been fascinated by myths, by the element of metamorphosis, a god turning into a swan, a girl into a tree, a man into a stag or hyacinth, and then there were the hybrid creatures, centaurs and satyrs. the bloody lacerations of the bacchants crowned in ivy and coupling with a fabulous leopard on the hill's wooded slope. But mostly it was a myth of Narcissus which obsessed her. If she stared long enough into a pellucid sea pool, she might dissolve her old identity and assume the permanent mask of beauty for which she longed.
Thank you. There are so many things in that piece which are important in your work, but I want to first comment on the way in which you actually read the passage, which was fantastically incantatory, almost as though language had the power of its magic in itself. I mean, and you were mentioning magic earlier on. Do you feel language has that power to transform?
Yes, very much so, yes. Language is the power of the word, and the power of the word recreates and transforms the universe. And therefore, if it's used correctly, it brings about metamorphoses.
Metamorphosis itself is one of the strongest things going on in this passage. I mean, how do you feel about the whole idea of metamorphosis?
Well, metamorphosis for me is an obsession because it's part of the process of writing poetry. A metaphor is a metamorphosis. So when I write poetry, my metaphors spiral. One metaphor spirals into another. So it is a constant series of metamorphoses in the way that the Ovidian metamorphoses deal with man into God, God into man, into flower or whatever. It's a way of seeing, but it's a way of seeing which recreates the universe, which to my mind is the poet's vocation and business.
It's almost as though there are no full stops in your world. Everything is redolent of something else, and everything is connected, as though there was a massive chain that one can only ever put one's finger on a part of, which also belongs to a much greater whole. Do you feel that?
Yes, I see things as being interconnected. A scent evokes something perhaps in childhood. Everything is interrelated, and in a good piece of writing, the whole cosmos is interpreted through symbols, is encapsulated and crystallized like that.
Right. When you talk about metaphor, I mean, I hear you always say my work, my poetry, although we've actually just read from a novel, and I know at the moment you're writing or have just completed a third novel, and yet you have this very, very strong particular identification with poetry. So I must ask you the question, what is it that you keep for your novels, or what is it that drives you to write the novels, which after all are very poetic novels? They're not, they're the novels of a poet rather than a novel or poetry. So what is it that goes in perhaps to your novels that doesn't to your poetry, or how does the relation between them work?
Well, I think there is in both the high concentration of poetic imagery, and if one could take lines, almost every line of that novel is a line that could go into a poem, which is the way I write prose. I think I use a novel to explore areas of the human makeup, and I use poetry to explore much more the relationship of oneself to the natural world and the transformations within that.
Right.
The human is often absent from the landscape of my poems.
Yes, that's interesting. It is. There's actually one poem you wrote actually on the writing of a novel. So I wonder if I can just ask you to read that, because it's quite an interesting comment on what I would see as the sort of silent dialogue, if you like, of your novels, where the novels are actually prose without dialogue.
That's right.
Interior monologues and dialogues with identity and self and other self.
Yes, that's right. Every experience becomes interiorized, so that the spoken word is omitted and unnecessary, because it is too trivial for the experience being relayed. Writing a novel. Coordinative pressure on the keys. The stream of liberated ribbon runs under the punched indentation of thoughts. Each typehead is the trigger of a gun, It fires precisely through a chafed black stream. The plot thaws, then backtracks into a blue congelation amid winter pack ice. I face the dazzle. Sneaking into view, a woman bolts from a car, her white shoes discarded as she runs across a beach. Red poppies twinkle on cerulean when her dress lifts. She leans forward to reach the crisp, flooding insurgence of the wave and stands, skirt hitched up, staring out across the smoky blue of the Adriatic. The left spool halts, then inches back its loss. Flow and counterflow. Now I see the man impatiently locked in his car, one hand drumming persistently upon the wheel. His dark glasses cast shadows on the sand. He sees the world monochromatically. Vexation cuts a twist into his lip. She's hardly visible, running the wave, outpacing the supine crawl of a ship. The Lido's beach parasols are pansies. The sands a mica glint of ivory. He drops a contact lens and curses her departure, lost from sight now, wave-struck, free to meet the future where it coincides. These are minor characters. A subplot the ribbon maps out, a hound on the scent. I leave her running on a string of dots.
There you are. It's not even a full stop at the end of that poem. We're on a string of dots.
Yes.
I find that particularly interesting because in a way I find it like your novels, your description of writing a novel is like your novels in the sense that there are fully formed pictures there rather than, I mean, the woman's set in her landscape, she's by the edge of the sea, the man's in his car. These are fully formed visual pictures,
yes.
but they're not interacting, those two characters, they're not having dialogue or whatever, which in a way I think is very much the case in your novels.
Yes.
But it's not about what you mentioned yourself a few minutes ago, most of your novels are about, which is, if you like, the landscape of the mind, and especially the lost and the intruder and the outsider and the mask and the metamorphosis, which is, there's just one, again, from quite an early poem, which I think sums those things up. This is a poem from Bleecker Street called Wrong Side. If I can just quote back to you a verse of this. Thus I'm perennially consigned to suffer things from the inside out and generate terror as being an intruder or someone who should be exorcised. I mean, that sense of the intruder, almost as though you, the poet, you, the man, were an intruder on your own life sometimes. And the sense of, especially in The Lipstick Boys, which is about what you call the night lost, those who are on the outside of society, those inhabiting dark corners, both of their minds and dark corners in terms of the places where they go to meet. All those things about a very brutal, solitary, miserable, nevertheless, in your work, hauntingly beautiful, in fact, life. That sense of the outsider, which is more, in fact, in the prose than in the poems.
Yes.
I wonder if you'd talk about that and the sense of being on the outside for you.
Yes, I think it's very conscious in terms of intrusion in the act of writing a poem. The question we went back to earlier, who am I, is the constant question in writing a poem. Who is the self that is being guided in this way to recreate worlds? Its correlation for me on a more societal level involves this outsider that I've written about in both those books, the person who, in a way, is an intruder into life because of some psychological vulnerability, some almost sense of not really wishing to belong, yet invested with the power of metamorphosing oneself in times of crisis. I think it's got very much to do with the fact that being a poet, you are probably the most isolated person in the world, because you work totally alone and you refer back to nobody. You live in a society that doesn't want poetry. You live in a society that doesn't read poetry. You belong to something which is an order, a very secret order to my mind, which again ties up with the love of masks and the fact that in Blue Rock, Claudette is writing about a secret society. To be a poet, if you're conscious of being a poet from birth and you always pursue that vocation, is to belong very much to a secret society. So perhaps when I translate that into a psychological pattern or a sociological pattern for a novel, the characters are invariably outsiders, members of secret societies.
Right. There's a very strong sense in your poetry of you, the poet, as the observer. I mean, even if you're not, and in your poems I feel you're far more of an insider than in your novels, because you have a place in the natural landscape, which seems a very natural place, in fact, and that you belong there in a way that you don't belong in the landscapes of the mind pieces. No. And you will use the phrase constantly in your poetry, I watched, I stood on the summit and watched, I saw, and as though you were always in a huge landscape, but part of it by the act of observation, which is, of course, to a certain extent what the writer does. A writer stands back and observes and collects, if you like. And there is a sense of integration in your poetry with landscape.
Yes.
Is that...
Yes, that's very important to me. Landscape and the sea, of course, are predominant symbols in my work, because I come from the natural world and the sea. But this business, this process of seeing, for me, of course, is all important, because poems are made by the eye. They're made by creating visual stills. One is, in writing a poem, one is faced with the diversity and enormity of the universe, and the poet's job is isolating particulars which are symbols of that enormity, and yet can be magically compressed into metaphors. And also, seeing is our greatest means of self-defense, which is why I often write about birds, because they are dependent on sight. Their whole world is visual. They have discarded a brain for sight, because you cannot have the weight of a brain in a bird. They are dependent totally on sight, and a poet as well is dependent on sight. And there's almost a sense in the poems that everything I cannot see is threatening, and therefore everything behind me is a world of unarticulated chaos. But the minute it's defined by the eye, it becomes measurable, and it becomes translatable into...
And controllable.
And controllable, yes.
And bearable, almost.
And bearable, yes, that's right.
Can I go back a minute to the sea, which also cropped up in the extract you read from Blue Rock? Now, you live in the city, you live in London, although I know you go out to the country a lot. But in fact, you were born and brought up in Jersey.
Yes.
And the power of Jersey, in the sense of being an island and being surrounded by sea, is very important, obviously, in the poem. But the sea seems somehow, sometimes even more than that again, almost like a moat around yourself. Yes,
I think I live very much on an inner island, having come from a physical island. The sea is important for me because it informs the rhythm and the breath of my work. Wherever I am, I can hear the sea, and I respond to the ebb and flow of the tide. So the sea really is my whole blood and metabolism. It's also got another purpose, in that the sea, in the wave coming in and the wave going out, is rather like the gender which is dealt with in Blue Rock. Masculine and feminine, the flux between the two. And so the sea, for me, yes, is very much an inner moat, as well as an awesomely physical presence, an element which represents to me total freedom and beauty, colour, mutation of mood. And presumably also the astonishment of
the sea as something which is in constant change yet always the same.
Yes.
Which is in a way the
That's
balance
right.
that you seek in
Yes.
much of your work.
Yes, that's right, very much so. It's chameleonic.
Yes.
And so that's what's important.
I wonder if I can ask you actually to read a poem from the more natural landscape sections. There's one I love particularly, Hail on the Rebound. Let's see if I can find that.
Yes, I think this is a good poem to read because it has the synesthesia and it has the way of bringing auditory, olfactory, visual elements into a single poem so that all of those things are tied up. Hail on the Rebound. A fizz, and then the rush is voluble. Hailstones, the size of mistletoe berries, are sieved through crevices, clicking marbles that split, ricochet and made angular, take off into a frenetic orbit, lose volume, and subside as frosted stars on asphalt and green-crested tufts of grass. Their cooling meets the temperature of air that has the surface clarity of glass, and in the pause between volleys the calm is urgent with the singing of a thrush whose notes test the air, with the quick alarm that flattens a cat to liquidity so that it seems possessed only of eyes. A single stone falls intermittently. It raps the crackle of a robin's beak tenaciously, chipping at a snail shell. Then the notes faster, and the air vibrates as though someone was kneading sacks of grain before they split and poured into a yard. This time, I rush outside into the lane, my knuckles stung by the dactylic ring of dice-sized ice cubes bouncing back knee-high from the crown of the road and scuttering to icy corners. They're like mushrooms grown up instantaneously before one's eyes. A sudden gust, and each ice spark is blown back in my face. I feel my clothes catch light with the incandescent brilliance of pearls, and then I'm running and my eyes are bright.
There's something extraordinarily beautiful about the imagery of that poem and the way in which you are there, belonging to that whole
Yes.
scene and last part of the
Yes.
things around you. And there is indeed, as I think I said before, a haunting lyrical beauty even to the night lost and
Yes.
the terrible traumas of the mind. I mean, is beauty something which you strive for, that you feel is important in your work?
Yes, beauty is very important to me. It's one of the guiding principles of my life, which explains the attraction to colour and it explains the attraction to the natural world, which of course is where one finds constant beauty. It's only when one enters the human world that much of that beauty disappears. Yes, I'm always saddened by the lack of beauty in contemporary writing. I look for it very keenly and find very little. I can think of no poet today whose writing I would call beautiful.
Why do you think that is?
Well, Ted Hughes writes with beauty in his poetry. I think it's because we are made to feel that we live in an ugly world and that the concentration is upon social events or upon political events or upon events which are removed from what is the true purpose of being here, which is, to my mind, the celebration of the beautiful and the recreation of it by the beauty of language. Constable once said in his notebooks that he had never seen a single ugly thing, in the sense that you can transmogrify almost everything into something of beauty by the power of language, by the power of visual transformation, which is what so concerns me. But I do consciously seek out beautiful things. and try to inhabit landscapes which bring me the recognition of those things. I can become entranced by beauty. I can meditate on a flower to a point of losing consciousness. These things for me are very important.
Can we talk for a minute a bit more about language and about the way,
Yes.
the sense in which you in fact seem to me to paint poems? I mean, most writers would say, I hear language. It's almost as though you see language. You see a fully formed picture. You see it full of colour. And I think there's one poem in which you talk about words as quartz crystals. And it's your craft in a way sometimes seems to me almost lapidary, like that you take blocks, coloured blocks, if you like, and put them together in the most incredible designs, and that colour, as you've mentioned, is incredibly important, and actually gradations of colour, not just blue or green, but very precise sorts of colour is very important to you. That actual way of perceiving. There's another poem which you say, I live on my optic nerve, which is something you were talking about earlier. Tell me about the way in which you perceive and see colour and see language.
Yes, for me, colour is of primary importance to my work. I tend to see poems very much in terms of colour. Everything has a colour. Each symbol in the poem has a colour. And it's unified into gradations of colour, which again relates closely to beauty. Beauty is almost impossible without some element of colour. And words, of course, in a way, words are coloured as well. They become like a necklace. Language to me is almost arrayed upon the craft of a jeweller, perhaps. The craft of the poems is very careful. The words are very coloured. So in a way, it is constructing out of the beauty of a language of colour.
That sense of arrayed on colour, arrayed on nature in a way, which is an interesting sort of almost obsession or kleptomaniac sort of theme in your work. I mean, David in Blue Rock collects things when he goes into Dr. Moravia's flats. He collects all those incredible silk ties and raids them to himself. It's almost as if you do raid the world for your precious stone blocks of language in like a kleptomaniac does.
Yes, I would very much say that, because I am obsessed with detail, and to see anything, you have to see it in minute detail. I think this is perhaps where my work differs from a lot of work, in that it's a way of seeing. Most people see an object, they perceive, but they fail to see what's inside it. It's rather like just seeing the external petals of a flower without seeing that the inside shading or the under petal is of a completely different colour. And if you don't come to that instinctively, then you never learn it and never know about it. And therefore the whole world is magical on that basis, because you are constantly discovering things which the human eye doesn't normally acknowledge or ever have the inquiring faculty to know.
Yes. There are a number of lines in your work, The Skies of Van Gogh, Brainstorm, and there's a poem on Daddy Longlegs where the insect's body is like a study for the anorexic thin line of a drawing by Giacometti. I mean, those very painterly, I mean, those are consciously painterly things, but in fact, I mean, the poems often feel as though you live surrounded by a painterly, I'm not saying that you don't live surrounded by a literary environment, because that's obviously true from a number of the references in your poems as well, but the painterly is extremely strong. I wonder if I can ask you just to read The Music of Blue, which is so very much about colour. Have you got it in there?
Yes.
I think I have it here.
Music of Blue. If there's a colour to contemplation, then there's a music too, if we could hear beyond the word eluding us. For air is resonant with notes that dissipate appear on our awakening, much as the flare of a blue match flame turns invisible when held up to the sun. Malame's fear was that the blue was untranslatable, and words were quartz crystals that wouldn't flow but interface themselves. Yet blue is sheer, demanding we brush it like the swallow with quick wing beats, for that altitude's clear both in the passage out and the return. There is a blue above, the grey below. Gradations of cerulean engage the eye in distinctions, for water keeps no constant hue, and I could name 15 subtleties of sea green and grey that meet on a sea horizon, blues that are green, and how a brilliant turquoise turns cobalt or becomes a sultry ultramarine as clouds compose and recompose the sky. This challenge here above a shifting bay of luminous sky lakes. Such flux demands a music that is neither blue nor grey, but isolates all colour in one band of light, energy fired in a crystal, as sunlight strikes on a lit cove of sand. Mastery of the blue means equipoise. If vision clarifies with depth, we need motion to create resonance. The two maintain this dynamic antitheses, create those atmospherics of true blue that give the poem mood, as a sad man might walk here in rain and colour the view. We must forever, like the sea jade sky, be moving into a new quality of light, intent upon a music known in the wake of migratory swifts, and see their arrows strains towards a hidden sun, composing clear notes for our memory to reassemble when those birds have flown.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. You've said that there's no division between your work and your life, and I think it's quite fitting that we end on that, which is an extremely beautiful poem. Jeremy Reed, thank you very much.
Thank you.